Hello and welcome to Larry Has Opinions. Today I'm talking about the latest novel by Damon Galgut, The Promise. This is currently on the shortlist for the Booker Prize, and it's the fourth book from the long list that I've read. And definitely I have to say my favorite so far. It's getting a lot of buzz and a lot of praise, but in case you haven't heard of this before, the whole story revolves around an Afrikaans family in South Africa, and they own a farm where they live. And as the book starts, the mother dies, and the young daughter called Amor, she witnesses a moment where the mother makes the father promise that they will give this small dwelling within the land that they own to the black maid who's been working for them for several years. The book is split into 4 sections, and the first section is set in the 80s, but every subsequent section has a time jump of about 10 years, give or take. So it's really interesting to see how the environment around this family also changes, and the political situation. Obviously starting from the 80s, where the country was still segregated on a racial basis with apartheid still in full swing, and down to more recent days where the political and social situation has evolved significantly, as I'm sure you guys all know. It's really interesting that this is all from the perspective of this white family. I've heard some people complaining that the black characters in the novel, they don't really get much of a perspective or voice in the book. And that is clearly very deliberate, because the whole story is very much from the perspective of this white family. And the book allows as much of a black perspective as it was allowed in that environment within the white family, who clearly almost see the black servants almost as kind of furniture, who are kind of there in the background, possibly even plotting against you, but very much at the margins and never having been given a voice. And also any progress that is made over the years is often portrayed from that sort of patronizing perspective, where the white characters would say something like, "Oh, do you see, we have a funeral and the black maid is sitting just next to us. How much progress have we made?" As if that was, the key metric to measure the progress in terms of the racial situation of the country. There's a lot of family drama that ensues in the different sections, a lot around these situations where the family gets back together, and a lot of this accumulated tension finds some kind of release during these moments. And Amor, the young daughter, is definitely a key figure in the story, because, as we said, she's the one witnessing this promise made about the property being given to the black servant. But crucially, Amor is not even sure herself if what she heard and what she remembers from that episode is actually accurate, and the promise was actually ever made in the terms that Amor interprets, which is very interesting. But on the other hand, it also becomes a completely irrelevant point whether the promise was actually made originally or not. It becomes a bit of a moot point. So Amor pretty much decides to disassociate herself from her family and becomes estranged from the family to a large extent over the years. But we see during these moments portrayed in the book, every decade when something tragic happens in the family, that she comes back, and she's the one always pushing for this promise to be delivered. And every time there's some kind of different reason or different priorities why the promise would not be delivered. And there's so much to unpack. It's such a multi-layered book, and the characters are incredibly interesting, some better realized than others. Amor is a bit of the moral compass in some respect of the whole family, but on the other hand, I think you can take different views as well in terms of her behavior and whether that's truly helpful behavior or virtuous behavior. She comes across a little bit of a saintly figure, but I think even her portrait can have lights and shadows. And on the other hand, you have the other, especially the old generation that are very much set in the archaic views when it comes to race. But on the other hand, they're always portrayed in a sort of sympathetic way to some extent as well, because it's that kind of scenario where you have your racist uncle, but he's still your uncle. So it's a very interesting perspective on family life and disagreement within families and these dramatic situations that ensue, and the whole relationship between the intimacy of the familial relationship when it clashes with political and social beliefs. And it's very much an allegory of the whole South African situation over the year. And I really liked how very vividly some moments from South African history are also inserted in the story. Like, for instance, the final rugby match against New Zealand, that sort of thing, or mentioning the different presidents in charge in each section of the book, and also portraying the challenges of this sort of evolution when you have really deep changes in society. It's not all easy and simple, and clearly some of the really dramatic situations with homelessness, with crime, with violent crime specifically as well, can be very challenging and very difficult to resolve, especially when you have widespread corruption in the political elite as well. So I found the story, the environment, the setting, and the characters incredibly interesting, incredibly compelling, I have to say. I also have a weird fascination with the history of South Africa as well. So I found the subject matter particularly interesting for me. This is the one that when I saw, even just before the long list, because I think Eric Carl Anderson mentioned it as a new favorite, as soon as I heard about it, I knew I really wanted to read it. So I think obviously this might not be for everyone, but for anyone who's interested in some of these themes, it's definitely a great insight into South African society. But aside from that, I have to say that the writing is what really stood out for me. It's just stunning. It's incredible. I've never read anything by Galgut before, but now I really want to read more by him. The prose is always incredibly effective, incredibly beautiful, and quite raw as well, very direct. But also, I usually despise books that have no breaks, that have really long chapters, no paragraph breaks. I really hate those, because I usually like to read a chunk of text, take a breather, go back to it, and so on. This one is the opposite. It's got really, really long chapters and no breaks whatsoever. And for some reason, I kept going. I just couldn't stop. Once I started, I just wanted to keep going. And it's not necessarily, well, it is also the story, but the story is interesting, but the writing is incredibly mesmerizing, I would say. And he manages to switch between perspective in this completely effortless way that I've never personally come across anything like this before. Typically, you have books that are in first person or second person or third person, and this one is all of the above. So you have moments where the characters speak in first person, others where it switches to third person, and other parts of the story where the author breaks the fourth wall and talks to addresses the reader directly in second person as well, in a very seamless and effortless way that I found incredibly compelling, I have to say. And along with that, the different point of view keeps switching. So it's not like other books where you have clean breaks between different POVs. This keeps changing. And sometimes it might be slightly disorienting, but I have to say that for the most part, it's done so masterfully that you never really feel lost, that you've lost track of who we're following. And virtually every single character that is mentioned in the book, or at least the vast majority of them, at some point will have their own POV. And the perspective keeps changing, keeps following the different characters. And it also changed to the previous section. So, for instance, Amor and Anton, the two siblings that are possibly the two most important characters, they they're always starting or ending each section, and that alternates between the different sections, which again is very interesting. But also all these minor characters as well get the opportunity to give us their POV during the story. And I've seen other authors trying to do something similar. This is not like he's invented anything that hasn't ever been done before, but the way it's executed here is absolutely masterful, and I was absolutely awestruck, I have to say, by the quality of the writing. So I'm really hoping this could win the Booker Prize. If you're watching this video, you probably already know, or you're about to find out. I haven't read all the books on the shortlist, but personally, between the ones I've read, this really stands out as a bit of a masterpiece, in my opinion. I have to say, if you're really interested in the history of South Africa and don't necessarily want to pick up a history book, but you want to learn more via fiction, I would definitely strongly recommend The Covenant. This is one of those multi-generational sagas spanning centuries and centuries, where we follow the descendants of different families over the centuries, and it's very comprehensive, very well researched. It's a 1,000-page book, or 1,100 or something like that, so not for the faint-hearted. But if you want that kind of broader perspective on the history of the country, and also on the mentality and where some of that mindset comes from, it's an incredibly compelling read. Crucially, that was written in the 80s, so the moment where it stops is pretty much where The Promise picks up, so before the end of apartheid. And again, it's kind of interesting to see in The Covenant the speculation about what might have happened in future when the end of apartheid wasn't necessarily as obvious or as inevitable as perhaps we might see it now in hindsight. So kind of random recommendation, but really another great book. So going back to The Promise, if any of what you've heard in terms of the themes and the subject matter and the characters explored in the story piques your interest, I think you definitely should read it. And for that reason, perhaps unsurprisingly, but my rating for the book is 10 out of 10. I hope you guys liked this video. Please give me a thumbs up. If you want to discuss this book further with us and our community, join our Discord. The link is in the description box. And I'll see you the next time.